Hello, and thank you for joining me on this short video, 100 topics in UK food law. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer, and what I'll be doing is running through each of these 100 topics. Now, you may be watching this on our YouTube channel, or you might be watching this as part of our online training service, which we've now made available to businesses. It's available through subscription, and if you're watching this on our online training service, you'll also have access to further videos on each of these topics, typically 10-15 minutes long, but also some webinars which are typically an hour long, so depending on how much information you want on each of the topics. Now, to select the topics as I go through this short video, I've got a bucket full of ping pong balls beside me, just off camera, and each ping pong ball has a number printed on it. It's a bit like an FA Cup draw, this. What I will do is I'll pick the numbers out at random, and then I will identify them on the screen behind. If you're watching this on our online training service, you can download a list of all the numbers, so you can cross them off as they occur, playing sort of food law bingo. But if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, it doesn't matter, they'll appear behind me. I'm going to place each of these topics into one of four categories. The four categories are a bit arbitrary in nature, but they are quite important. The first is food hygiene. Food hygiene is enforced by environmental health officers and really relates to the premises, the practices, the equipment used in the preparation, storage, distribution of food, as well as things like training and fitness to work of staff. The second category is food standards, and this is enforced by trading standards officers and includes basically, most of this is in relation to the food itself, so it's the composition and the information provided about the food. We have general food law. General food law applies across the board and is enforced by all the agencies involved in food, and it includes some important definitions. And lastly, we have import and export. We have specialist officers working at the ports, for example, veterinary officers who inspect products of animal origin being imported or exported, whatever's happening there. And we have official fish inspectors who are environmental health officers, port health officers who are environmental health officers, plus a whole range of support staff and specialists. So what I will be doing is placing each of these topics into one of those four categories. So if you have any queries about a particular topic, you'll know where to go. Now, I've simplified the enforcement arrangements there. Some of you may have noticed that. There is a separate webinar or video where I'll go through the enforcement arrangements in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, because food is a devolved issue. So I've really sort of summarised it there and talking about environmental health officers and trained standards officers, but for the purpose of this video, it will suffice. So another reason why it might be important is if your business falls in the scope of the food hygiene rating scheme, then anything I refer to under food hygiene law and place into that category will be relevant to your food hygiene rating score. Okay, well look, without further ado, let's crack on. We've got 100 topics to get through. The first one I've already just picked up, and that is number 6, contaminants. You'll see it highlighted behind me on the screen. Contaminants are chemicals that are not intended to be present in food, and they can fall into different categories. We can have biological contaminants like mycotoxins. I'll come on to those shortly. We can have environmental contaminants, things like lead and things like that, which might get into food from the environment. We have things like process contaminants, acrylamide. I will come on to that shortly. The point about contaminants is you can't always prevent them being present in food because we live in an imperfect world. Some processes will actually create them. However, there is an obligation on food business operators that contaminants are present in as low as reasonably achievable levels. So this contaminants generally is a food standards issue. Moving on, we've got number 64. Bear with me while I just find it on the screen beside me. Number 64 is significant change in food activities. As a food business, you would need to be typically registered with the food authority, and that's the local authority. I'll come on to that shortly. But if you change the nature of your business, perhaps you're doing different products, perhaps you're using a different process, perhaps you've built an extension on it, whatever. If there's a significant change in your business, you must notify the local authority of that. And that is a food hygiene requirement. The next number is number 32. So 32, let's have a look. 32, Calorie labelling, that applies in England. You'll notice if you go into some of the larger cafes or coffee shops or whatever, when you go to buy your donut, there's a calorific value displayed next to it. There will also be a general sign telling you the average calorific recommended intake for an adult. Okay, well, most of us just turn a blind eye and eat the donut regardless, but it's a food standards issue because it's food information. The next one is number 81. And number 81 is foods not of animal origin. We'll find that foods are often classified into groups for the purposes of law. And foods not of animal origin will be things like fruit and veg, herbs and spices, things like cornflakes or anything of that nature. It's not of animal origin, so it's rice, it could be alcoholic drinks, whatever. Typically they're referred to in hygiene law, but most appropriately used in import and export, and that's where I'm going to put that category. Number 20. Number 20, spirit drinks. Nothing to do with ghosts. What we're talking about, spirit drinks, are things like whiskey, gin, vodka. There are standards specified in law in terms of composition, in terms of labelling. So it's a food standards issue. Number 78. Number 78 is sanitary and phytosanitary checks. These are checks carried out on foods at the port of entry. So it's an import and export requirement. And then we have number 30. Number 30 is food hygiene rating scheme. I mentioned it in my introduction. If you're not familiar with it, in England it's a voluntary scheme, but in Wales and Northern Ireland it's mandatory, prescribed by law. And basically what it is, you have an inspection by an environmental health officer, and they will rate your business according to a number of criteria, including the sort of structural integrity and cleanliness, food hygiene practices and safety practices, but also the confidence they have in the food manager and in the food safety management systems. So they'll come up to a score, they'll apply this into a rating of 5 for very good premises, down to 0, not so good, in fact very bad premises. So that's the food hygiene rating scheme. Those ratings are published on the Food Standards Agency website. So it's a food hygiene issue, quite clear. We then have number 76, which I believe is trombones time, a border control post. Border control post is a port of entry which has been authorised for carrying out checks on imported foods. So you'll have typically a border control post will be looking at products of animal origin, live animals, or certain foods not of animal origin being imported in as part of our import control checks. So things like Felixstowe would have a border control post, Heathrow Airport, Southampton Port, these will have border control posts associated with them. So it's an import and export issue. Number 82. Common health entry document. They're coming out quite kindly at the moment because a common health entry, a CHED, is a document used to notify the border control post. If you're an importer, you notify that you're bringing in a product of animal origin from around the world to a border control post, and you tell them it's coming so that they can do their checks on it. And that CHED, there's different types of CHED, but the CHED also serves as a record of that the checks have been carried out, and that CHED will go into the first destination inland, where environmental health officers would typically check to make sure that relevant foods have been imported lawfully. So that's an import and export. Number 31. Where are we going with 31? We're going to nutrition and health claims. Two different issues, both of them food standards. Nutrition claims on a label relate to things like low fat, high fibre. These are specific claims that are set out in the regulation relating to nutritional values, if you like. Health claims are a little bit more, I suppose, broad in nature. You can have a general health claim, good for you, or something like that, or you can have specific health claims, such as, contains vitamin D to help development of, or help the normal development of bones, or something like that. I don't know, I'll paraphrase that. So health claims need to be authorised. They're regulated and they're authorised by the Food Standards Agency or Food Standards Scotland in Scotland. So you can only use a health claim if it's been regulated. There are some exceptions to that, but it's a food standards issue. Now it's got like that, and it's number 90. Sorry, I was looking at it, even though it's got a line on it, I was looking at it upside down. This is how it all works on this one. An external temporary storage facility, ETSF. When stuff comes in the ports, this is clearly an import and export issue, is obviously subject to checks by customs and by port health officers, whatever. But they can't check everything at the port. So some goods are forwarded from the port of entry to a warehouse that's under control of customs. That's a customs warehouse or an ETSF. So this is an import and export issue. There we go. We have number 14. Number 14. Food for specific groups. Food for specific groups would include infant food, follow-on formally. It would include things like food for people with gluten-free diets. It may include sort of weight reduction foods or foods for people who need meal replacements. You can see the sort of thing I'm talking about. Sets out composition and labelling rules, food standards issue. Number 13, that came out quite well. Bottled water. Bottled water can be different types. You can have just bottled water, you can have spring water, you can have mineral water. There are compositional and labelling standards set out for each, and therefore this is a food standards issue. We have now number 61. 61, zooming across to the next one. Pasteurised milk. Pasteurised milk, there are legal requirements for temperature or pasteurisation for pasteurised milk. It's a hygiene issue, it's hygiene law. Pasteurised milk should be pasteurised to 72 degrees centigrade for a minimum of 15 seconds or 63 degrees centigrade for 30 minutes or an equivalent. So it doesn't have to be those temperatures, but it has to be equivalent to them. So hygiene law. Let's have a good old rattle through these. 56. So 56, sorry, I'm just trying to find the thing on this screen. Composition. Composition relates, well, to the composition of foods. Some foods do have requirements of composition. I mentioned things like perhaps butter or chocolate. They have standards set out in law. So it's a food standards issue. Now we have number 62. Number 62, temperature control. Is a food hygiene issue, temperature control. Generally speaking, foods that can support the outgrowth of microorganisms should either be kept cold at 8 degrees centigrade or lower, or kept hot, so 63 degrees centigrade or higher. Certainly that's England, Wales, Northern Ireland. Not in Scotland, it's a bit different, but that is a hygiene issue. Number 72, heat treatment. If you have a food that has bacteria present, a raw food, piece of raw meat, and you subject it to a heat treatment, you won't kill everything. Bacteria will die off depending on the nature of the bacteria. Some can form spores, some can survive at higher temperatures than others. But typically, on a sort of average bacteria population, when you apply a standard heat treatment, you'll kill a certain proportion of them. So as a general principle, the more bacteria present in a raw food, the more chance the bacteria will survive a standard heat treatment, like pasteurisation, for example. So heat treatment is an important issue, a management issue, and that is a food hygiene issue. Number 34. Number 34 is minimally processed foods. I've just said heat treatment. Well, we're talking about some foods that don't go through very much treatment at all. Things like steak tartare or gravlax, for example, would be foods that are not really heat treated at all or very minimally. So if you've got minimal heat treatment, you need to make sure they're safe to eat. And so it's hygiene management systems are required. So it's a food hygiene issue. 67. 67 is food waste. If you're producing food, you're bound to produce food waste. How you manage that and prevent it from contaminating foods and generally making sure it's got rid of appropriately is a food hygiene issue. So then we move on to 95. 95, mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are biological contaminants. Remember I said contaminants are typically food standards issues. They're chemicals produced in food. Mycotoxins were produced by fungi. That's the myco bit. Toxin is poison. So these are produced by molds, things like penicillium or aspergillus molds. If you have some grain that's been left not properly looked after, maybe in humid conditions, then you might get mold growth. In order for the mold to grow, it will break into the food and it will basically give out these sort of chemicals to help it grow into the substrate. And these are mycotoxins. So mycotoxin standards are really important food standards issues. Number 24. Number 24 is E. coli 157, a very nasty pathogenic bacteria. In other words, a bacteria can cause food poisoning. In vulnerable people, young children, elderly people, it can be fatal. And it can be fatal in very small numbers. You don't need many E. coli 157 bacteria to cause infection. Associated with things like raw meats, but also soily vegetables, because it can be found in the soil. Really important pathogen to make sure is controlled in a food environment. Make sure cross-contamination between raw foods and cooked foods doesn't occur. And it's a food hygiene issue. Number 58. Number 58. Product recall. If something is wrong, say you have some food contaminated with E. coli 157, then what you would need to do is recall it from your customers. So a product recall is when you try to bring back a food from your customers. That's a general food issue. Number 91. Number 91 is personal imports. I've talked about imported food up till now, and that relates to commercially imported food. If you want to bring food in for your own personal consumption, there are some different rules that apply, but it is an import-export category, if you like. Number 33. Number 33 is nutritional labelling. On a pre-packed food, like a, I don't know, packet of crisps or packet of cornflakes, tin of baked beans, you'll see nutritional information. You'll have your energy values. You'll have your macro ingredients like fat, carbohydrate, salt, fibre, that sort of thing, but also maybe some minerals and vitamins if they're present. This is a food information issue and therefore is food standards. Number 50. Number 50 is vacuum packed food. This is where you get a food, put it into a plastic pouch, draw out all the air. So you've got no oxygen in there. You seal it up. You do that to increase the shelf life. It can have food safety implications. Therefore, it's a food hygiene issue. Number 83. Number 83, thawing of food. If you don't thaw food properly, it can have implications in terms of heat treatment, because if your chicken is still frozen, you put it in the oven, it's going to take longer to cook. So it's a food hygiene issue. Number 40. And number 40 is food packaging. Food packaging, the nature of the materials and the activity of the packaging. Because these days, some packaging can create new atmospheres. It can give an indication of shelf life and all sorts of things. Food packaging generally is a food standards issue. Number 8. Whoops, sorry, I went off the list then. Number 8, systems based on HACCP principles. HACCP. HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point System, is a food safety risk assessment. And the law does not require for HACCP to be put in place. It requires for systems based on HACCP. For many low-risk operations, this can be achieved using proformas, like systems like Safer Food, Better Business, produced by the Food Standards Agency. For more complex operations, a more detailed validated risk assessment is required. Food hygiene law. Number 4, food labelling. Providing information to the consumer as part of a label is a food standards issue. Number 41, acrylamide. Acrylamide in food, mentioned it already. This is a process contaminant, so it's a chemical that can be produced in food as a result of a process. Typically, we're talking about high starch foods being processed at high temperature, things like chips, for example. The law doesn't require specific levels to be achieved. What it asks for is that food businesses processing these foods put in place mitigating factors to basically achieve as low as reasonably achievable levels of acrylamide. So I said contaminants is a food standards, but this is a food management issue and it falls within food hygiene law. Odd, I know, but it does. Number 38. So number 38 is UK geographical indication schemes. These are schemes that actually protect names of food. You might have a Melton Mowbray pork pie or Colchester oysters, and because they're protected, you can't make Melton Mowbray pork pies in Cornwall, or Colchester oysters can't be produced in Scotland. So there are protection schemes to protect certain types of food. Food standards issue. Number nine, we have advertising. Advertising of food is a food standards issue, but as well as trade standards, advertising on broadcast media and social media and websites falls to the Advertising Standards Authority as well. So it's a food standards issue. Number 73. Number 73 is health certification. If you're importing a product animal origin from around the world, then that product will need to be certified by the competent authorities, by the authorities in that country. So you'll need a health certificate, typically to accompany that food to the border control post, which you've notified using your system I haven't talked about yet, but using a CHED system. And the health certificate would also be required if you're exporting certain products of animal origin to, for example, the European Union or other countries around the world. So it's an import-export requirement. Number 49. Number 49, Clostridium botulinum, an important pathogen. Well, actually, it's not a bacteria, it's a whole group of bacteria under the name Clostridium botulinum, split into two types, two classes. One class will grow at room temperature in products like tin foods, for example. Another one will grow at refrigerated temperatures, but they share a common feature. They grow in the absence of oxygen. So if you've got a vac-packed chilled food, then Clostridium botulinum, if it's present, might grow if conditions are correct for it to grow. If you've got a tin food and it's not been properly processed, then Clostridium botulinum might grow in there. To be honest, growing the bacteria is not the issue. The issue is the production of neurotoxin. Very, very, very dangerous toxin. Okay, it's been harvested and manipulated to produce Botox. It's the same thing. Botox is produced from Clostridium botulinum toxin. But if you eat Clostridium botulinum toxin, the outlooks aren't great unless you get, there is some treatments available, but if you don't get yourself to hospital very quickly, you might end up dead. So it's a pretty serious pathogen, and the management of Clostridium botulinum is really important in canning and in chilled foods where you've removed oxygen from them, like in vac-packed food I talked about earlier. So Clostridium botulinum is a hygiene issue. We then move on to 55, residues. Residues might be veterinary residues, things like drugs used in animal husbandry, or it could be things like pesticide residues. Of course, we have to have standards, and they have to be pretty strict. There are food standards issues. Number 39, we have food enzymes. Well, food enzyme might be used in the production of food, but we also these days get things like food supplements that include like coenzymes and all this sort of thing. Enzymes are regulated products, and therefore if you're going to put an enzyme on the market to be used as an ingredient, it needs to be authorized. So food enzymes is actually a food standards issue. Number 100. Here we go, 100. Oh, my favourite, coagulase positive staphylococci is a mouthful. Why do I include coagulase positive staphylococci? Because you will find reference to them in food law. Coagulase positive staphylococci, the most famous one if you like, is Staphylococcus aureus or Staph aureus. That particular bacteria can be found in infections, particularly in things like subclinical infections or in cows. So coagulase positive staphylococci, often associated with raw milk. It could be that you get a subclinical infection in an udder where the cow is shedding Staph aureus into milk. So there are legal standards about this. It's a food hygiene issue. Where we are, number 29. So number 29, we have food fraud, food crime. Food fraud obviously is a major issue. If you put something on the market and it's not what you say it is, then that could be food fraud. Sorry, food crime is where it's more organised, and these days food is a global commodity. So we do get products that are being sold all around the world which are subject to international fraud. Products particularly vulnerable with things like honey, for example. But food fraud, food crime actually goes across the board. Hygiene and standards and it fits into general food law, and it fits into import and export. So we would squash that ping pong ball flat and put it into 4 categories. Number 52, food contact materials. Food contact materials include knives and forks and cups, conveyor belts, buckets, anything that is intended to come into contact with food must be suitable and must not transfer its components. Certain contact materials like plastics, there are very strict rules. Food standards requirement. Move on to 53, that's helpful. Authenticity links into food fraud. Food should be what it says it is. A lot of authenticity issues relating to honey was one example. It's a food standards issue. Number 25. So number 25, sorry if I just manipulate around. Foodborne viruses. The most common foodborne virus would be norovirus. The Food Standards Agency reckons there's something like 380,000 cases of foodborne norovirus in the UK every year. Other viruses, hepatitis A, hepatitis E, might be associated with things like shellfish, but norovirus can be person-to-person spread, of course. So it's the management of foodborne viruses is really important. They don't grow in food, but they can be transmitted by food handlers, for example. It's a food hygiene issue. Next one is number 26. That's convenient. Microbiological criteria foodstuffs. Basically, there are standards set out for certain foods in hygiene law. Some standards apply to the safety of food. Some standards apply just to the process that's making the food. But it is a food hygiene law requirement. Number 37, food additives. I said food contaminants are things that you don't want in food. Food additives are deliberately placed in food to get some sort of effect in the food, a technological effect, for example, like food colours, food sweeteners. These are food additives. They're regulated products, so they have to be authorised. When they're authorised, they're given an E number. People don't like E numbers. They like to think of them as being horrible chemicals. I like to think of them as approved chemicals that have been approved for specific purposes. Emulsifiers, things of this nature, they have been assessed to be safe. And as long as they're used in the correct foods at the correct levels, everyone should be fine. Food standards issue governs the use of food additives. We then have number 48. 48, high-risk foods not of animal origin. I said in import issues, and this is an import and export issue, products of animal origin are subject to checks at the port. Foods not of animal origin, fruit, veg, herbs and spices, generally are not, but some foods not of animal origin are more high risk. For example, peanuts from China are well associated with concerns relating to mycotoxins. Remember the fungal poisons. So therefore, when they're imported, they're treated as higher risk and subject to more scrutiny. It's an import and export requirement. Number 99. Bacillus cereus. Bacillus cereus is a food poisoning bacteria, often associated with consumption of poorly cooked or handled rice, and it's a food hygiene issue. Number 5. Number 5 is, apart from being man alive, is organic food. Organic food is obviously produced to certified organic standards. You can only call a food organic in the name of the food if 95% of the agricultural ingredients are indeed certified as organic. Organic is a food standards issue. Next one is 46. 46 is cooling of food. Hugely important that food is cooled under proper management arrangements to prevent bacteria such as Clostridium perfringens from growing. So cooling is subject to management controls. It's a food hygiene issue. Number 80. Number 80, products of animal origin. Products of animal origin, meat, fish, dairy, eggs, honey, frog's legs, bladders, I don't know, whatever. Anything of animal origin. If you're importing them from around the world, then they have to go through a border control post for proper veterinary checks carried out by enforcement officers at the port. So products of animal origin is an import and export issue. Number 79 import of products of animals, food and feed system. Now, I said you will, if you've got a product of animal origin being imported from around the world, you need to import it via border control post. You use the IPAF system to notify the port of entry that you're coming in with your product so they can carry out their checks and that they can generate a CHED document to verify those checks are being carried out. So it's an import and export issue. Number 22. We have honey. Honey is very vulnerable to fraud. Honey has standards about it, compositional and labelling standards. So it falls within the food standards category. Number 7. We have traceability. Traceability is a general food law requirement. The basic obligation on food businesses is that you must know where you get your stuff from, ingredients or foods coming into your food business, the one step back. But if you're supplying other businesses, you must know who you're supplying them to. The one step back, the one step forward approach is the general basic level of traceability. But there are additional requirements depending on the product and depending who you're supplying. But traceability, number 7, is a general food law requirement. Number 51. Number 51 is sous vide. Sous vide is a minimally processed food. Basically, what you would do typically with sous vide products is you would get a food like maybe a steak, you put it into a plastic pouch, seal it, vac pack it, so take the air out, seal it, and then you cook it at lower temperatures, typically in a water bath. By doing that, you can retain the texture of the meat. So you cook it at lower temperatures for longer periods of time. Clearly, there are food safety management issues there, and therefore it's a food hygiene category. We move on to number 3. Number 3, record keeping. There aren't many legal requirements to keep records. Most of the food hygiene law is written in a way that records only need to be produced commensurate with the activities of the business. So there might be some record keeping required as part of your systems based on HACCP principle. There may not be, depending on the level of your business. But it is a food hygiene issue. Number 92. Number 92. Commodity codes. If you're importing stuff from around the world or exporting stuff, there needs to be an internationally recognised reference, and that's commodity code. We have the UK tariff, which is published online. Every single thing you can think of, not just food, but everything from machinery to furniture will have specific commodity codes, CN numbers. These CN numbers are very specific to a product, so you might have a specific CN number for a hazelnut in shell, for example, which would be very, very specific. So it's an import and export issue, but it's also used in food standards. Often when you get compositional labelling requirements that apply to specific products, the law will refer to the CN numbers, the commodity codes. We move on to number 98. Salmonella, food poisoning bacteria, can cause fatalities, but in most normal, fit people who get infected with salmonella, they normally just get unwell for a period of time. But it is a significant cause of food poisoning in the UK. Associated with poultry, I guess, is one of the big ones. But it's a food hygiene issue, the management of salmonella in the food business. Number 71. Cross-contamination fits in nicely, doesn't it? Because one way of preventing salmonella food poisoning is preventing cross-contamination from raw poultry to ready to eat. Cross-contamination or cross-contact for our American viewers is basically that, is preventing bacteria, food poisoning bacteria, getting onto ready-to-eat food. It can be direct by just, raw chicken dripping onto cooked chicken. Indirect, because you put something on a work surface, put a raw chicken on a work surface, and then you put cooked chicken on the same work surface, or the food handler. It doesn't really matter. There's lots of different ways it can be transmitted. The important thing is a food hygiene issue to manage cross-contamination so it doesn't occur. The next one is number 60. So 60 is raw drinking milk. Prohibited in Scotland, but in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, it is permissible to place raw drinking milk on the market, but typically it's on farm or farm gate or through vending machines or through farmers markets, direct sale. You can't buy raw drinking milk in the local supermarket. So there are obviously lots of potential food poisoning implications about the management of raw drinking milk, so it's a food hygiene issue. Picked up 2 there, so next one is 97. 97, Clostridium perfringens. I mentioned cooling of food, and I referred to Clostridium perfringens. This is a food poisoning bacteria that forms spores during normal cooking operations. If you don't cool foods like stews and meats and things like that, and they've got Clostridium perfringens present, they will form these spores, and if you don't cool it properly, the spores will germinate and the bacteria will grow, causing food poisoning. So it's a food hygiene issue. Number 96, that was handy. Eggs. Well, there's lots of things about eggs. There are hygiene requirements for eggs, but the majority of controls for eggs relate to marketing standards, so it falls within food standards. Number 2. Primary production. Primary production relates to the hygiene, so it's a food hygiene issue. The hygiene obligations at the initial production of food, so it's farming, fishing, hunting, something like that. So when you have on-farm hygiene rules, clearly they don't have to be as strict as restaurant hygiene rules. So primary production tend to be a little bit less strict. You don't need to have a food safety management system at primary production level, for example. Often, whilst it's a hygiene issue, you may find it's trading standards officers that enforce that because they're on farms for other reasons, like animal feedstuffs and things like that. Number 15, food supplements. Food supplements are foods that are marketed in such a way they contain higher levels of vitamins, minerals or other nutrients that have some effect, and they're sold in dose form. A dose form is important. It could be a tablet, it could be a capsule, it could be a gummy, it could be a scoop from a tub. But the 2 issues are important in the definition. Specific composition and labelling requirements is a food standards issue. We then move on to number 45. 45, nature, substance or quality. 3 offences created in food law. If you place on the market, to the prejudice of the purchaser, food that is not of the nature, substance or quality. Nature is the food you've asked for is not what you've been given. You asked for cod and chips, you've been given pollock and chips, for example. Substance would be something like a foreign body in a food. And quality, the food has fallen below either a standard that's set in law or an expected standard. Typically in enforcement, substance, foods not of the substance, either foreign bodies, are dealt with by environmental health, whereas foods not of the nature or quality are dealt with by training standards. So it's actually a general food issue though. Number 85, we have best before date. Durability date. When you put a food on the market, typically it'll have a shelf life. If you've got something like a packet of biscuits, it will have a best before date. It relates to the quality of the food. As long as you eat the food before the best before date, you can expect optimal quality. If you eat it after best before date, well, it might be soggy biscuits or broken biscuits. They might go off flavour, but it won't be unsafe. So best before date relates to the quality of the food. You can eat foods beyond its best before date. You can even sell foods beyond its best before date, as long as they're marketable, if you like. So it's a food standards issue. The next one is number 75. So number 75, residue control plan. If you're importing products of animal origin, remember meat, fish, dairy, eggs from around the world, a basic requirement is they look after the residues. Remember things like veterinary residues, medicines used in animal husbandry. We need to make sure that they're under control at a very basic level. So anyone exporting products of animal origin to the UK will have to have residue control plans in place. So it's an import and export issue. Number 88. Identification mark. If you pick up a packet of cheese or cooked meat in your supermarket and look typically on the back, you'll see an oval. It will have, for example, GB, then 2 letters and a number. GB is Great Britain. The 2 letters are the local authority where the establishment, which is the number, the registration number of or approval number of the establishment, is held. So in other words, that oval, GB, with a number and letters, if it's produced by a local authority, tells you the local authority where that food was last processed or manufactured or whatever. So it relates to approved establishments. It's a food hygiene issue. Number 77, compound products. Compound products, this is an import and export issue. This is where you've got more than one product of animal origin in the same product, if you like. So you've got, I can't think of an example, chicken, ham and spam fritters. I don't know, it doesn't sound very appetizing, but you're importing not just chicken or not just ham, but your mixture of them. So sometimes specific rules might apply. You might need different health certificates for the different components of the food. It all depends, a bit complicated, but it's an import and export issue. Number 10. Number 10 is marketing standards. These can be general or specific. General marketing standards will apply to a whole range of products, but you'll find with marketing standards, if you go into your supermarket and you're looking at Class A eggs, for example, that's a marketing standard. Class A eggs must meet the criteria in marketing standards to be able to describe themselves as such. Or a Class A apple, for example. These are marketing standards, they are food standards issues. Number 63, we have unsafe food. Food is unsafe if it's injurious to health or unfit. This is a general food requirement. Number 93, we have ready-to-eat sprouts and sprouting seeds, things like bean sprouts. Been outbreaks associated with them, salmonella outbreaks in the past. They need to be approved. They're regulated product, need to be approved by a local authority. So it's a food hygiene issue. Number 94, modified atmosphere packaging. Talked about vacuum packaging earlier on. If vacuum packaging, you remove the air or the oxygen from a package. So you've got cooked meat, you put it in a vac pack machine, remove all the air. Modified atmosphere packaging is you pump some gases back in, maybe nitrogen, carbon dioxide, or a mixture of gases, in order to prolong the shelf life or protect the product. It might be a bag of crisps and you just want to make sure that the crisps aren't squashed. But it's a hygiene issue. Number 74 is composite food. A composite food is a product of animal origin and a food not of animal origin. Chicken curry and rice would be a composite food. Has a role in hygiene law, but mostly it's important in import and export law. Number 16, we have fitness to work. I talked about things like viruses, norovirus being common in food. If you've got a food handler who has norovirus and actively filling their trousers, so to speak, well then they're not fit to work. There needs to be management arrangements to make sure food handlers are not ill when they're handling food. So it's a food hygiene issue. I've got two here, look. 68. And 68 is food equipment. Should be suitable for use, should be kept clean, maintained. It's a food hygiene issue. Number 35. We have irradiated foods. This isn't something foods are exposed to a nuclear explosion or something. It's perfectly legal to irradiate certain foods. You'll find it often. It's things like fruit, sort of herbs and spices that might be irradiated. The important thing is if they're irradiated, there are some rules about that. But most importantly, they must be labelled as such. So therefore, it's a food standards issue. Let's tick out a couple more. 86. 86 is Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. CITES protects endangered species. There are certain foods out there like caviar, for example. Sturgeon is a protected species. If you want to import caviar, you need to make sure you're not breaching the rules, restrictions on the amount you can import, things like that. It's an import and export requirement. Number 84, a use by date. I said a best before date is where like a packet of biscuits might become a bit soggy, towards the end, but it's a quality issue. A use by date, on the other hand, is a safety issue. Because if you have like a pack of soft cheese or cooked meat, there might be a date where the manufacturer is guaranteeing that it's safe, but after that date, it is in law unsafe. So therefore, if you have a food that's expired its use by date, don't eat it. It's a food hygiene issue. It needs to be managed properly. Number 44, we have animal byproducts. When you slaughter an animal, most of the animal, of course, go for meat production, but there are other bits that you can't consume. They need to be disposed of appropriately. Now, the method of disposal will depend on what the animal is and a whole range of things. Obviously, we want to avoid things like foot and mouth outbreaks. We don't want to be feeding our pigs bits of old pigs, do we? So animal byproducts is a key issue. Mainly food standards, but it also has food hygiene implications. Move on. The next one is number 11. I picked 3 up here, so I'm trying not to drop them. Food allergen management. Food allergen management. There are 14 food allergens prescribed in law, and the way that they're managed within a food establishment is quite key. You don't want cross-contamination. If you've got a dish that contains peanuts, that's fine, but you don't want those peanuts to turn up in a dish that doesn't have them listed in the ingredients. So the management of that is a food hygiene issue. We then got number 54. 54 is presentation of food. This is how food is presented to the consumer. If you use lighting or water treatment, something to deceive the consumer, so they think they're getting something that they're not, that would be a breach of law. It's a general food requirement. Number 66. Number 66 is layout, design, construction, or sizing of food premises. This is absolutely essential. To prevent cross-contamination or cross-contact, you need to have properly designed premises so that you have adequate space to prevent raw and ready-to-eat foods coming into contact. You have adequate space to prevent food handlers contaminating food, adequate places to put your food waste. It's a food hygiene issue, and it is a fundamental and essential one. I'm getting near the bottom of the bucket of balls here. So number 47, veterinary checks. Veterinary checks are performed at the border control post on products of animal origin by your official fish inspectors and veterinary officers at a port of entry, the border control post. So if you're importing a product of animal origin, meat, fish, dairy or eggs, you pre-notify using IPAFs. They'll go to the border control post, veterinary checks will be carried out, and then the product will be, assuming it passes veterinary checks, released with its appropriate CHED endorsed. Number 23. Control of listeria. Listeria monocytogenes is a particularly nasty pathogen, food poisoning bacteria. There's not a lot of infection to be said in the UK. However, it can grow at refrigerated temperatures, and albeit very slowly, it can grow in vac-packed foods, without oxygen. So it is clearly of concern in cooked chilled foods and foods of that nature. It can also hang about in food environments, very difficult to get rid of. So it's a food hygiene issue. Number 42, we have food brokers. Food brokers are typically people who buy source materials, foods and whatnot for manufacturers, for example. If I'm a manufacturer, I want to get hold of some honey, I might go to a broker who will then go onto the world market, because these are commodities, locate a source of honey for me and arrange for it to be delivered to me. The broker may not actually touch the food themselves, but they'll arrange for it to be delivered to me. They do fall within the scope of food registration. So I'm going to put food brokers in food hygiene, just because I can, really. Okay, so the next one, I've just engineered this one because I picked it. I noticed it is number 43, and it just happens to be there because I mentioned food registration. There is no licensing scheme for food businesses in the UK. You don't have to have a license, but you do need to be registered or approved by the food authority. The vast majority of premises will be registered. So you go to your local authority and register. You can do it online, fill in a postcode and it will tell you which your local authority is to register. There are some exceptions for just ad hoc businesses. So if you're running a school fete once a year, you won't need to register, that sort of thing. The next thing, so it's a food hygiene issue. The next thing is number 17. Jam and similar products, I mentioned earlier on, are subject to composition and labelling requirements, so it's a food standards issue. Number 70, personal hygiene, washing hands, making sure you're not transmitting norovirus to your customers. It's a food hygiene issue, and obviously a fundamental one. Number 1, approved establishments, quite timely. I said premises have to be either registered or approved. Most businesses are registered with the local authority. Approved ones are those establishments that are placing on the market products of animal origin, so meat, fish, dairy, eggs, etc., on a wholesale basis. So if you're making meat products, boiling hams, supplying them on to other businesses, other establishments, then you may need approval. There are exemptions, but that's the distinction. The next one is number 12, food allergen information. I said the management of allergens is a food hygiene issue within a business, but the actual presentation of information on a label or verbally, that's a food standards issue. 89. 89 is private attestation. You need a health certificate if you're exporting food, typically, But under certain circumstances, instead of having a health certificate signed off by one of the official officers, you can use a self-certification, if you like, a private attestation. So it's an important export issue. Number 65, training of staff. There is no legal requirement for staff to receive certified training. The law requires that food handlers are adequately instructed and supervised and trained commensurate with their work activity. So if you've got somebody working in a food business, as long as they're told what to do, as long as they're doing what they say they're, what they're being told to do, and you're supervising them to do that, then that is the obligation. Having a certificate is not a legal requirement. When you're inspected on a food hygiene inspection, typically environmental health officers will be asking questions of staff, see if they know what they're doing, but they'll also be watching them to make sure they are doing what they say they're doing. That's far more valuable than a certificate to demonstrate that. So that's number 65, hygiene issue. Number 36, we have novel foods. Novel foods, new foods. These are foods that have not had any evidence of substantial consumption within the UK or within the EU prior to the 15th of May 1997. That's when the law first came in. So they drew a line at that stage where they said, right, okay, if it's on sale, people have been eating it before now, fine. If not, it's a regulated product, and before you place on the market a novel food, you need to get it authorised. Typically, it's the Food Standards Agency and Food Standards Scotland who would deal with the authorisation in the UK. And there we have it. So it's a food standards issue. Number 18. Number 18, cocoa and chocolate products. There are standard composition and labelling requirements, so it's a food standards issue. Number 27, shelf life. I've talked about the fact that you can have a use-by date or a best before date on a food. When you produce a food, you need to think about the shelf life. At what point does it become unsafe? At what point will it become unpalatable? And determine that appropriately. It's actually a food hygiene issue to properly develop an appropriate shelf life for a food. The next one is number 87. So 87, we have health mark. I mentioned identification marks. Do you remember on a packet of cheese or cooked meat, you have an oval with GB and numbers? A health mark is a bit different because an identification mark is put on by the business, but a health mark is put on by a meat inspector. So at a slaughterhouse or a cutting plant, the meat inspector will visually inspect a carcass and stamp on a health mark to verify that that has been looked at and is fit for consumption. So it will typically have an oval, GB and a number. The number is the number of the approved slaughterhouse or cutting plant. That's a hygiene issue. Number 28 is Campylobacter, another food poisoning bacteria out there. Can be found in the environment, but can be associated with things like raw meat, milk. So is a food hygiene issue. Number 19 is CBD products. These are products derived from the cannabis plants. You'll see a lot of CBD drinks and supplements and all sorts of things out there. They're regulated products. They are novel foods. At the moment, at the time of recording this video, the Food Standards Agency has drawn a line and said, right, anyone who's made an application for approval of or authorization of a CBD product can continue to sell it on the market. But if they haven't made an application, they can't. So there's a list available on the Food Standards Agency website. If a product's on that list, it can continue until the agency get round to looking at it, in which case they might take it off the list, in which case it can no longer be sold. So it's a regulated product. It's a food standards issue. Number 21 is raw fishery products. Raw fishery products, as well as the sort of bacteria food poisoning associated with raw fishery products might also include parasitic worms. These would be wild caught fishery products. So in order to ensure that people aren't going to be infected with parasitic worms, the law requires that certain fish, wild caught raw fishery products, are going to be consumed raw, would need to be frozen prior to consumption. It's a hygiene requirement. We then have number 69, and number 69 is water supply. Water has to be potable. If you're spraying it on your crops or your lettuces, or you're using it in a food business, it must be potable. In other words, ready to drink. It's a food hygiene issue. We then have the penultimate one, number 57, Less than thoroughly cooked burgers. Less than thoroughly cooked burgers, by the name suggests, the best way of serving a burger is the McDonald's way. Cook it properly. Core temperature 75, everyone's happy. The thing about beef burgers is on beef joints, the contamination, E. coli 157 or other food poisoning bacteria, like to be on the outside. So in order to supply someone with a less than thoroughly cooked burger, you need to remove that contamination. If you just mince up a joint of beef, you can just include the bacteria inside the burger. If you don't cook it properly, it can cause food poisoning. So typically for minimally less than thoroughly cooked burgers, you can cut away the outside of the beef joint before you mince it, or you can sear it on the outside. You do both. But there is also another method, that is if you get beef supplied to you from an assured supply chain, an specially approved establishment, then you can apply a properly validated lower temperature cook. It's all hygiene issue, number 57. And lastly, product withdrawal. I said that product recall was taking food that you believe was unsafe back from customers. Product withdrawal is taking it back from your business customers. So if you're a manufacturer and you find that you've supplied cheese with E. coli 157, you would do a product withdrawal to remove it back from the supermarkets. You'll do a product recall to get it back from your customers. So there we are, there's 100 topics. As I said, what will happen now is if you go to our website and you subscribe to our online training, you can watch a separate video, 10-15 minutes long, on each of those topics. And then if you want more information, you can watch a webinar of about an hour long on each of those topics. There are also additional text online training courses available as well as part of the package. So if you don't subscribe, fair enough. Keep an eye out on this channel. I'll be posting some more videos in due course. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video. Cheers.